Hello, everyone. Welcome to Random Encounter 290-290. My name is Jono, Logan, and there's no time to waste because we have a game that is releasing in just a few days that people have been waiting arguably since 1997 for. But I think that it's going to be a absolute joy for these folks because we have a review on the site, and it turns out that this game is pretty damn good. But let me introduce the person who has reviewed the game. Zach, welcome to the show.
I want to say aloha because I've played a lot of Infinite Wealth recently, but yeah.
I gotta say, playing Infinite Wealth and Final Fantasy VII Remake back to back was an interesting experience. But I think we might talk about that in a bit. First off, we're talking about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. It's going to be coming out in just a few days. I suspect that if you were listening to Random Encounter, you know all about Final Fantasy VII. But I'm going to give you a very brief recap of this RPG. So in 1997, I would argue that RPGs and the entire gaming industry as a whole were changed forever with the release of Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation. Up to this point, Final Fantasy games were a Nintendo-only franchise. Square Enix moved over to PlayStation because they hated the fact that the Nintendo 64 didn't use discs. And I think that is the moment where the perception of a lot of video game fans changed over from Nintendo to PlayStation.
Oh, yeah.
Because Final Fantasy VII looked so good, especially compared with every other RPG out there. Nothing looked like Final Fantasy VII.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I was moving around a lot when I was that age, and the fact that it didn't release for the Nintendo console, deeply upset me because I owned a 64 and I was like, what, Final Fantasy is not coming out for this console? So yeah, it made me a Sony person basically since.
Oh my God. I remember before Final Fantasy VII was released, in the very early days of the internet, Square Enix released it was a tech demo. It wasn't on a platform. It was just a tech demo of Celes, Locke, and Shadow fighting in a 3D environment. And it was like their battles.
It's very cool.
It's very, very cool. And everyone was like, this is what it's going to look like when we get a game on the Nintendo 64. And then everyone was really pissed off at first. And then they got 7 and they were like, oh, we're not pissed off. This is awesome. Anyway, Final Fantasy VII was such a massive success that it turns out that Square Enix, up to that point, they've been releasing sequels, but they never released a standalone sequel. And they were like, ooh, this is a cash cow. So since then, we have gotten Before Crisis Final Fantasy VII, the movie Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy VII, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. And we also got in 2005 a PlayStation 3 tech demo that showed off what Final Fantasy VII could look like on next-gen systems, which pissed everybody off, and for good reason, because there was they kind of announced it and people were like, oh, we're getting a Final Fantasy VII remake for boo. It was great. Anyway, 10 years after that, Square Enix finally made the announcement that 7 would be receiving not just a remaster, but a complete ground up remake. And since then, we discovered that their goals were actually a little bit more ambitious than that, and they would be releasing a trilogy of games that retold the story of Final Fantasy VII, starting with Final Fantasy VII Remake. That was released on the PlayStation 4 on April 10th, 2020. Really not bad timing there, since a lot of people had some free time at that point. It was then re-released for PlayStation 5 with updated visuals and Final Fantasy VII Intermission, which was a piece of DLC starring Yuffie. On June 10th, 2021. And now, finally, the second part of the trilogy, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, is on the verge of being released this February 29th, 2024. Now, as I mentioned before, Zach, you actually, you sat down, you reviewed the game, so you are one of the very few people in the world who know the answer to the question everyone is wondering. And that is, do Cloud and Sephiroth kiss?
I will not be revealing that information.
I would be surprised if you did, because Square Enix would kill us if we divulged anything about that. Incidentally, if you're going to be listening to this podcast and you're a little bit worried, we are not going to be talking about big story spoilers about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth for a number of reasons. We don't want to ruin it for everyone, and also, it's some of that stuff. Is that stuff still under embargo? I think it's still under embargo.
It won't be by the time this releases.
Okay.
So embargo lifts on the 22nd.
Okay. I might just name this episode Dumbledore Dies then, and just let just let you spoil it. Yeah, so, but we will, however, be talking a lot about Final Fantasy VII Remake spoilers, because obviously this is a direct follow up to Final Fantasy VII Remake, and we kind of have to. And in that spirit, I actually, over the last 2 weeks, finally played Final Fantasy VII Remake. My short review is, yeah, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good review. It's a pretty good game, and it's a very, very good remake. I was impressed on just about every single level how they took the the brilliance of the original game and expanded on it and updated it and made it feel extremely modern. There is nothing, despite what some people might say about the textures, there is nothing dated about this game. It's a tremendous, tremendous achievement. And I think a lot of people were a little bit nervous going into Rebirth that are they going to be able to pull this off? Because the first one was just focused on Midgar. It was, we didn't go anywhere else. It was entirely based around this one city. And obviously, if you played Final Fantasy VII, you know that once you leave Midgar, the world opens up and it's amazing. And it's, oh my God, you have so many possibilities to look around. Is that moment at the beginning of this game? Because the end of the game, at the last game, it ends the same way as when they leave Midgar in the original. Do you have that moment here?
I mean, sort of, not really. So, I mean, you kind of have, I think that moment really is captured at the end of Remake. Here, the game actually opens in, it's hard for me to talk about how it opens. It's not really a spoiler. I mean, it's literally the beginning of the game, but it opens with Zack. So I've always liked him. I guess he's just the same name as me. It opens with Zack, and Cloud is is in Midgar, and he's trying to escape from Shinra, and Shinra basically wins in the very beginning of the game. And Zack manages to at least pull the bodies of Cloud and Aerith away from the wreckage, and then it flashes over to what we've seen in the demo. And so in terms of how that's all possible, I have some answers, but I won't give them away. But I think that the general thinking, at least at this point, seems to be that it's like an alternate timeline. And whether that's true or not, I will not spoil, but I will say that I think that's clearly what you're meant to believe at the very beginning of this game, because it basically says like 5 hours later or like 5 hours earlier or something like that. And it's like, well, obviously this didn't happen within 5 hours, and the story of Nibelheim must have taken at least 5 hours. So,
well, if anyone out there has not played Remake and has somehow miraculously been able to avoid spoilers, which I was able to for years, I was able to avoid spoilers. They might be a little confused because Zack's dead. That's a key point of Final Fantasy VII because, Cloud kind of absorbs some of his memories and skill and basically becomes an idealized version of himself. And that's a key part of Final Fantasy VII's story. So at the end of Remake, throughout Remake, actually, there are like specters, essentially. I started calling them the continuity police. And whenever the story seemed to diverge from the original Final Fantasy VII, these specters would kind of step in and force things back on track. And then at the end of Final Fantasy VII, your team essentially fights fate and kind of frees up the world to make new choices, thus opening the door to new story possibilities. And in doing so, at the very end, we discover Zack survives his shootout, I guess you could say, and we see a version of him carrying a version of Cloud into Midgar as our characters are leaving, theoretically in two different timelines, like you said. Because another little thing is there's a cartoon character named Scout. He's a Shinra mascot dog, and as Zack is carrying Cloud, I think it's a bag of chips or something floats in front of the camera, and it shows that Scout in this reality is a different breed of dog, showing this isn't quite the world we know. Very confusing, especially if you had no idea if you haven't played Final Fantasy VII, what was going on. Now, clearly you and I have.
Yeah.
And it sounds like they managed to pull it off. Also, it doesn't sound like it sounds like Cloud did a better job than Zack when it came to the fun that happened in Midgar.
I mean, that's definitely true. Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I mentioned this in my review, and we'll kind of get more into this, but I they marketed Rebirth as like, oh, this is a perfect starting point, and I think that is absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
Sure, like, would you enjoy Rebirth because it's a good game? Sure, probably. But
Hmm.
Remake is also a good game. Not quite as good in my opinion, but it's a good game. And so much of, and this kind of couches my feelings about it, like so much of my love of Rebirth and Remake as well is driven by my love of the original game. And I can't separate myself from that. I can't be objective about that. And so like when there's like this big moment that is recreated that I remember from when I was 12, like
Hmm.
that's a big deal to me. And so, you know, I'm certain that I have. There are people who are listening to this who have never played Seven. And first of all, go back and play it, especially because it's accessible like everywhere now, and you can turn on like infinite limit breaks and beat it in like 12 hours if you want. But
Yeah, it's a pretty good game.
it's yeah, it's I would have a hard time believing that you would enjoy it as much without that context, and it's working in a way that is meant. I think you're meant to have that knowledge, to be honest, and I think that it would be a fundamentally different experience otherwise.
I think it's a fascinating approach, and I was fascinated while playing it that they are. I can't think of any other form of media that has actually done this, where Final Fantasy VII Remake and presumably Rebirth, uh, it's a remake that follows every single story beat of the original, and yet is technically a sequel in terms of how they are treating the narrative. It's all been done in another way to put it. When I was playing it, I was wondering, I kept thinking, oh, in Rebirth, I'm hoping that they kind of explain this in a way because the fact that fate is pushing them along this certain track is very, very meta. And I was hoping at some point in this game that they would address the meta-ness of that. Like, is this a form, is a new life, for example, is this a form of not resurrection? What is the word I'm looking for? Reincarnation. Like, have Aerith and Cloud experienced this before, or is this like a parallel universe, as it's been said there, or what's going on? It wasn't in that game. Is there a little bit more of that in this game, or do they just say fate's beaten, now we're on our own?
It's I can't answer that question.
Okay.
To be honest with you, I think that let me put it this way. So I beat and obviously enjoyed Final Fantasy VII Remake quite a bit,
Hmm.
but I was very critical of the ending, not because I had a problem with the meta-ness of it. I had a problem with the suddenness of it, and I just
Mm.
thought it was like an it was a way of them excusing any choices they made. Like, hey, you know, at least that was the way I read it at the time. I'm not saying I agree with that necessarily now. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is remarkably faithful to the game in the ways that matter, and it plays with some of those ideas. In terms of how important they are or what they are, it, it's difficult for me to answer that question. Um,
Okay,
yeah.
that's fine. I'm assuming that everyone will find out for themselves in a very short amount of time. One of the things that I really found myself interested in Final Fantasy VII Remake was the way that. Okay, here's an admission. While I have played Final Fantasy VII all the way through, I have not played any of the side stories, the prequels. I've not seen Advent
you're
Children.
you're not missing much, trust me.
That's one of the reasons I haven't played any of
Yeah.
it. Especially having children. I've heard
Oh,
dreadful things.
they're
Um,
playing it in theaters around here, and like I can't go see it, but like I wanted to just go hate watch it, but I
mm.
can't. So that's where I am.
But one of the things that really drew me into this game was how they took what back in the day were remarkably like fleshed out characters, but in retrospect, it was a PlayStation RPG. They've taken these, I guess, the skeletons of these characters and their various their characterization, and they fleshed them out into much more well developed characters. Now, in this game, we clearly have some new recruits who are joining the party. Some of whom we've seen a little bit. Yuffie, for example, we saw in the DLC. Red 13, for example, we got to see a little bit, but Red 13 was never a actual like party member. They were like a support character. How does that continue in this game in terms of
Oh,
developing the character roles beyond what they were in the original?
it's just wonderful. I mean, if I had to point out one thing that I love about this game, it's the character work. It's just so strong. Um, I Red 13, I can't get into too much about Red 13, but like they do this fun stuff where like if you've played Remake, you know that he has like this deep voice and he's like all wise and stuff. And then like everybody talks to him like he's a dog, and like there's this like really fun interplay where like, and it's funny every time that he gets mad about it. And Yuffie, she's introduced in a really interesting way, because those of you who've played the original know that she's actually optional, and you have to like randomly encounter her.
It's random. Literally, it's random.
And in this case, it's definitely not. There's no way we could build the game that way. But she's just like such a shot of energy and joy and silliness, that she's a delight. Kate Sith is even like pretty good. I enjoyed Kate Sith, and that's how they pronounce it in this game, for the record. Yeah, it's Kate Sith. But the thing that impressed me the most, honestly, is the character work they continue of that main cast. Like Aerith, and I think I said this in my review, is almost the main character here. And she is just so full of warmth and strength, and she's such a remarkable character. We just did like a draft on Retro recently where we drafted our favorite supporting characters, and I think that I might have picked her now, this version of her. That's how strong I thought she was. And they just build them and build them and build them, and the writing here is even better. And you know, like if you go back and play Final Fantasy VII, like so much of the characterization is given through the way the character models are behaving. Like if you look at like the way that, you know, someone's like sort of kicking their foot or whatever, or someone's acting shy, and that's still here, but they take that and they flesh that out into this whole big thing of all the achievements of the trilogy. I think that's the big one. You think about someone like Jesse in Remake, and they just do such good work with that here.
Oh, I knew Jesse was going to break my heart.
Yeah, fantastic work.
In terms of shipping, like, you know, there's you have Cloud, and you're like, okay, which is it going to be? Aerith is going to be? No, I was Jesse all the way. I loved her.
I can't say anything about the date at Gold Saucer because that is specifically embargoed. But I will just say that they do some fun stuff with it. Let's just say that.
I have to admit, I know that Fate was broken at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Yes,
but the fates of the rest of your Avalanche cell, it drove me a little crazy at the end, where it was like, oh no, guess who survived? And I was like, really? Wasn't he like shot to death and then like passed out and died on a pillar that then collapsed into like, okay, that is I'm surprised that he managed to live, but sure.
I have responses to that I will not give you.
Okay.
It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot that I think that we don't know that you do, and I think that's got to be a little bit of a frustrating position for you to be in. So let's talk about something that is not embargoed in any way, shape, or form. Well, I guess the Gold Saucer is, but the mini games aren't. So something that really, I know I talk about it a lot on this podcast, but screw it. Like, I was like, ooh, someone put a lot of Yakuza into my Final Fantasy in Remake, and there was a lot of Yakuza in this Final Fantasy game
for sure.
Walking around Sector 6 was like, wow, this feels a lot like the Champion District. When I was in Seventh Heaven and there was a dartboard, I walked up to it and I was like, hey, there's darts, and it plays differently but similarly enough to darts in Yakuza. So mini games were a big thing in Remake, and it sounds like they've expanded on that considerably in Rebirth, understandably, because Golden Saucer. So what are some of the mini games here, and how are they improved, interesting? Like, what do we have?
I mean, there are, I mentioned this, like the number of mini games here, like, is absurd. Like, it's,
you actually said there's more than Infinite Wealth, which I have so much trouble believing.
I completely understand where you're coming from on that. I'm not sure that I accessed every minigame in Infinite Wealth. Mm-hmm. You know, that game is so big, right? But there is just so much to go on here. And, you know, I want to take a step back. And I think it's interesting that you say that there's so much Yakuza here, because in a lot of ways, while I was playing this, I was thinking like, Yakuza is so much a successor of what 7 was doing as well. Because you think back to Final Fantasy VII, there was like so much silliness and goofiness and tonal oddness in that game. Mm-hmm. And so many mini games, and I feel like that sort of, Final Fantasy 16 goes in one direction, right, where that's all basically eliminated, and then Yakuza goes in a different direction. It has been for a long time, and I feel like this so much feels like Yakuza so much feels like it is a successor of that sort of tonal balancing that you have to do, that you have to do with 7, and that they do so remarkably well in this game. But to actually answer your question, there are an absurd number of mini games, and they are like everywhere. Like almost every side quest is going to involve some sort of mini game, whether it is catching a chocobo, because every time you go to a new zone, if you want to get a chocobo, you have to go catch a chocobo, and you can't unlock fast travel until you do catch that chocobo. The Gold Saucer has a ton of games, and I think some people have compared Chocobo Racing to Mario Kart. They are correct.
Ooh, that sounds like
Chocobo
fun.
Racing plays exactly like Mario Kart now, and it's so much better. They have like an almost like Asteroids-like game that you can play there. They have a battle arena. They have like this fun like punch 'em game where like you're kind of like reacting to what the other person does. There is chocobo gliding. There is, oh my goodness, there's Queen's Blood, which is this incredibly involved, incredibly difficult card game. There's Fort Condor. There's
Fort Condor's back. Okay.
Yeah, there's another RTS sort of defense game that you have to play as well. There's and I haven't even scratched the surface here. Like okay. I'm forgetting stuff. There is so much to do, and I think sometimes, occasionally, it works to the game's detriment, because like it'll be like, hey, you have to go play this mini game to go forward, or you have to play this mini game to get your chocobo, which you really need to do if you want to explore the spaces. And so sometimes, and those of you who have played the demo, like you literally have to vacuum up Mako in the demo, which is like absurd and boring. And there's one dungeon where every dungeon sort of has like its own gimmick, which it's not a mini game, but it feels like a mini game. And one of them involves you like throwing boxes at things, and like it was not fun, but there's so much variety that like they hit on 95% of it, and the 5% of the misses I'm okay with. Like it's just like it's like a playground. It's just like this. What do you want to do? Go do it. It's fun. In terms of the mini games, that's not true with all elements of the game, but in terms of the mini games, yes.
I'm glad that Fort Condor showed up. I mean, I played through all of the Fort Condor content for Intermission, which actually might have been my favorite part of it thus far, because I really like tower defense and strategy games. But I was playing it, I was like, it seems like an awful lot of work to put into a board game for a little piece of DLC. I wonder if it'll be in the next game. And it was. Neat.
Yep. It sure is. You only have to play like 4 games of it to do like a particular side quest, but it's a little bit harder, I think, than it was in Intermission, but it's back.
Is there anything as remotely as frustrating as the pull-up minigame?
Pull-up minigame? No. Well, I don't know. I found Queen's Blood so frustrating. It's basically like this game where it's all about like numbers. Like you have 3 rows, and you are trying to, with those 3 rows, get the numbers the highest in your row. So basically, like you might have cards that are worth 11 in your row, and they might have cards that are worth 12 in their row, which is usually what happened to me. And whoever has the winning number then like gets to like take those points at the end of the game. And it's like really, it's a really complicated game. It's not really that complicated. It's simple on its surface, but a lot of strategy underneath. And they have you play it a lot. And that was a little frustrating. But in terms of like actual frustration, like I found some of the stealth mini game type stuff a little annoying. But no, in terms of like sit-ups, like I spent probably a good hour and 45 minutes on that in Remake, and I didn't do that with any of the mini games in this game.
I am not to... Okay, I'm about to say I am exceptionally good at rhythm games and button pressing games. And I was playing this stupid pull-up mini game, and I think I lost the first time, and the second time I got it perfect. I didn't screw up once, and I still lost. And I was like, what? And I kept playing, and I kept losing, even though I was getting it perfect every single time. The idea that a developer would include a mini game where it is possible to do it perfectly and yet still lose was infuriating to me.
I understand. Yeah, it was. It's actually back, but in like a very minimalistic way. So
Okay.
And you definitely don't have to do it.
Well, like I said, with the amount of mini games in here, and I assume there's quite a few side quests as well. I remember when I was playing Remake, I was like, I don't think he was infused with like the soul of Zack. I think he was infused with the soul of Kiryu. Just his like the granite faced man, and just I don't want to.
Like I guess I'll go do the thing you want me to do. Okay, yeah.
Honestly, if I was playing the Japanese audio, I have an odd feeling there'd be close ups on Cloud every 5 minutes going Nani.
That's fair.
One of the things that you mentioned when you were talking about the catching your own chocobo is exploration. So in Final Fantasy VII, obviously, once we get away from Midgar, the world opens up, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in the overworld, just like we would in any other Final Fantasy game, and like so many possibilities, so many places to go. I have an odd feeling that there's no overworld in this as we would have expected it back on the PlayStation or even Super Nintendo era. However, it sounds like there's a lot of places that you can explore. Are they open world, or are they like walled gardens that are
walled gardens?
So there's substantial walled gardens throughout.
Yes. Yeah, there are 6 substantial walled gardens throughout. The first one you explore is the grasslands, which is right outside of Calm and outside of Midgar. And then you move on to Junon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So like there are these big, huge, massive zones. There's so much to poke around in, so much to explore, so much to see. And you know, we'll get to the graphics later, but beautiful vistas as well, sort of littered throughout. And, you know, when I first got to the grasslands, I was like, okay, this is enormous. And I was like, there's got to be more zones than this. And there are 5 more. So I will talk a little bit about some of my criticisms with it in a second here. But I think that just the amount of poking around you can do, and the amount of just like sort of, you know, walking around, and they give you every different zone has a different chocobo. So like one can climb up walls, one can glide over canyons, for example. One can float over water because he's like sort of like has like this crystal that allows him to shoot water down, and he like kind of flies over water. And so
what you're saying is Final Fantasy VII is a Metroidvania.
Yeah, I mean, no, but I mean, like the power ups you get are definitely not Metroidvania like, but it definitely has a feel for giving you a lot of different things to do, and you could clear every zone the minute you get there, except for like a couple of like small like side quest things that open up. But there's a lot going on in them. They're not perfectly designed, but there's a ton to do. Like I spent, you know, at least 8 hours in a few of the zones, just kind of walking around, and, you know, this is pre-release, so I had no guide. And if I was lost, I was like, well, I'm just figuring it out. And I made sure I figured it out. I got every single point of interest on every map before I cleared it. So,
well, we're going to talk about, this is going to be controversial because I have an odd feeling that the response on the internet is going to be to get good. But my least favorite part about Final Fantasy VII was the combat, because it seems like I'm extraordinarily bad at it. Like I think I'm real bad at it, to the point where I ended up going on YouTube and watched a bunch of combat tutorials about all of these characters and learned everything. And then I went back to the game and I discovered, oh no, I'm still like I'm just bad at it. And then finally, by the end of the game, very end of the game, I started getting the hang of it. And then I started up intermission. I was like, oh, Yuffie has a new combat style. Oh, good. And I was I'm extremely bad at it again. That being said, there are so many things to celebrate about the combat system that I can see. For example, every single character in Final Fantasy Remake plays completely differently. Like they have completely different combat styles. And if you want to get the most out of the game, you really do need to learn these different combat styles. Considering that the playable characters in this game have opened up with 3 new characters, which I imagine are 3 new combat styles, and I imagine that the combat styles of the already existing characters have shifted and have changed and been refined, or what's the combat like in Final Fantasy Rebirth?
It's pretty similar. There are some additions to it. So the biggest addition, honestly, is the synergy abilities. So you have 2 different types of synergy abilities. One of them is something that sort of unlocks as the fight goes. It's sort of almost like a limit break. There might be something else under the surface that unlocks them that I couldn't figure out, but I never did. And it's sort of like a super move that you can unlock through your skill panel, which I guess we'll talk about in a minute here. But And then you also have like synergy abilities with each character. So like Cloud and Reds allows you to like do like a distant, like sort of like magic shot at like flying enemies, which is where I used it the most, because flying enemies can be a pain if you're not playing as Barrett or Aerith. And that's true in this game as well. But it is pretty similar. And, you know, honestly, you shouldn't feel bad. I am also bad at this game.
Oh, so bad.
And I've played this game and Remake and Integrate. I've played it for 150 hours now, probably in total, this basic combat system. And I think that the thing that's interesting about it is that for the most part, and this is true in this game as well, like there's a trick to almost every fight. And if you unlock that trick, it's not too bad. Like you hammer them with lightning at a certain time because they're weak to it and they're charging up their unblockable move, and you nail them with that and it cancels it, and you pressure them and then you can stagger them from there. And Tifa is broken and Barrett
Tifa's
is almost
broken
as
in the original
broken.
game already.
Yeah. And Barrett is almost as good. And also maybe even better if you're bad, because you can just stand behind everything, which is what I did a lot. But yeah, it smooths things out. Like you definitely have more options. You don't feel as boxed in to like you have to have a ranged character, because you're going to have some ranged options with other pairs of characters like Red and Cloud, neither of whom are ranged at all. So you have more options. And Yuffie, those of you who've played Intermission, or is it called Integrate or Intermission? I can never remember.
Intermission. Integrate is the I have the problem with this too.
Yeah.
Integrate is the PlayStation 5 version, and it's everything all in one package.
And Yuffie plays really fast and fun, and if you can kind of get the elemental switching down, like she is really good. Red actually plays a lot like Tifa in some ways. His stagger isn't quite as good, but his counter is really strong, and he can he has a move that allows you to get HP back from the enemies, which is really nice. Kate Sith, I honestly can't even tell you how that guy plays. Like I played through the game, and like Kate Sith, like by default is not on his Moogle, but then you can summon the Moogle and he'll take some hits and you have some additional moves. But the way that like his skill tree it looked like he's really meant to be a tank. But unless I was absolutely forced to use Kate Sith in honor of the original game, I did not use Kate Sith. So yeah, but like you definitely have more options. But like I found myself going back to my old faithful of I need my big damage Cloud, I need my stagger Tifa, and I need my magic user Aerith. And elemental weaknesses are more important in this game, which in some ways is useful. Like your assess materia is your friend, because like you will get moves on every character that allow you to like cast like a no MP ability that like is lightning. And that is extremely valuable in this game in terms of building pressure and stagger and damage. So yeah, it plays very similarly. If you've played Remake, you will fit right into Rebirth. Well, most of us will, except for those of us who are bad like us. So yeah, I struggled. I died more in this game than I did in any FromSoft game. Let's put it that way. So that's where I am.
Okay. I have been a little bit, dreading is not the right word, but worried about it, because like cripes, I was bad at it. I never got to the point where I was considering putting it on easy mode, but there were some battles where I was just like, nope. And by the end of it, I was just like, I'm not going back to get the rest of the summons. I'm not going to put myself through that. I'm not enjoying some people adore the combat system, and it's just one of those things that maybe I just don't get it. I don't know why, but
I mean, honestly, I love it. I think it's awesome. I just know that I'm not good at it. Like I watched my wife play the demo and she's just, like ripping through everything. And I'm like, oh, this is how you play this game. And then I sat down and played it. I'm like, I'm a little better, but not much better. So yeah, I think it's great, but I also acknowledge that I'm not very good at it.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned in the review, there's no Hell House in this game, essentially, it seems.
Now, there is one boss that really gave me a lot of trouble, and I won't say anything else about that, but it involves a lot of countering, and I didn't enjoy that. So otherwise, I thought that it never became absurdly challenging, whereas like I was like, oh, I'm fine, and then Hell House wrecked me for hours.
Yeah. I managed to get by, actually, weirdly, I managed to get by Hell House after about an hour. Reno and Rue destroyed me, though. Oh my god, that was the moment where I was like, okay, I need to start watching some things on YouTube to figure out how to play this game, because I have no idea.
That's a tough fight.
I gotta be honest, that was my biggest problem with Final Fantasy VII Remake, is that, yes, I'm bad at the combat, but besides that, a lot of the combat is not explained in game, or I don't feel like was effectively presented to the player. I feel like a lot of it, you really do need to go to an outside resource to learn how to effectively play this game, at least properly. This may have just been my experience, but I was like, that I feel is a drawback. And it sounds like that might still be here where, yeah,
Oh, for sure.
you can get by, but if you want to really get into the details of it, you need to usually look elsewhere for it, either to
Yeah.
YouTube or your wife.
Yeah, I mean, like I abused items like crazy, and it's funny because I was like, oh, I should try out hard mode for my review, and then I tried it, and I got to the first boss in Nibelheim, and I just got obliterated like for like an hour straight, and I'm like, nope, hard mode's not for me.
Aw, yeah. Um, how does it look? Final Fantasy VII Remake, I went into it knowing a few things. One of which is the internet was, shall we say, somewhat picky about texture issues when it was released on the PlayStation 4. And I was playing it on my PS5. I was playing the PS5 version. And even I was like, okay, there's some, I don't understand why some of these textures exist like this. It makes no sense to me that they would put however much effort they put into like Aerith's bracelets, for example, that look amazing. And then they would use like literally a 2D texture for the flowers for a close up of them. It was just like, what are you doing? That is such a weird choice. Or like the textures on the train controls in the train graveyard. And it literally, it's just like a texture over top of like polygons. And you're like, that is such a weird choice to make. And everywhere else, the game looked incredible. How does it work in Rebirth? Are we going to be having more complaints about doors, or are we going to be having complaints about other things instead?
You know, that's a good question. There's actually, we're recording this a few days before the game's embargo lifts, and we just got, I can say this because this will go up after, we just got notification that they're dropping a patch tomorrow for the graphics. And so my hope is that improves some things, but I'm going to be honest with you. Like, I don't notice that kind of stuff the way some people do. Like, so I started it up in graphics mode. It defaults to that because there's two modes, graphics mode and performance mode, which, you know, it's pretty normal nowadays. And I thought graphics mode was dire. Like, I was getting like a little sick looking at the frame drops. And every time I turned my camera, I think you may have said this, like, I just felt like I was like, I can't do this. Like, I was like, I can't play this whole game if it looks like this, not knowing that they had put me automatically in graphics mode.
Yeah, I put myself on performance mode for Remake, and I tried graphics mode. I was like, this doesn't look that much better for the loss in frames.
Yeah, and I guess I found myself to become more of a frame person, and I thought, and I know that there's a lot of discourse already out there about Rebirth in terms of the graphics, and in performance mode, I personally did not notice a whole lot. You know, every once in a while, like my wife would walk by, like, "Well, what's up with that texture?" I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I guess you're right." So I am maybe not the the best person to talk about that particular issue. Maybe it's my color blindness. I don't know, man. But I definitely noticed that things seemed a little fuzzier than even they did in Remake, but also like the scope they're working with is so much larger than what they're working with in Remake that like anything like that felt like complaining. Like I only really notice stuff like that when it's like, I don't know, like Pokemon Violet and Scarlet, which looked like worse than Dragon Warrior 1 to me. But like I really don't notice very often that sort of thing. And so like for me, it ran really smoothly. I had maybe like very minimal frame drops at very busy fight moments. But that's still pre-release. So what we're going to be getting on the 29th, we'll see. And my review will hopefully reflect that because I'm going to test it out before the review drops. But yeah, I can't say with certainty how it's going to look. But for me personally, like, I don't know, I thought it looked great.
Yeah, it's been 4 years since Final Fantasy Remake was released, and 4 years. This was built ground up for the PlayStation 5. You can't play this on PS4. So you would expect there to be a measure of higher graphics fidelity after 4 years, but the reality is they're still using the same engine. And because we're no longer in Migger, I imagine that most assets are new. They'd have to be because it's a different world out there than in Migger. So I would hope that it would look better after 4 years, because otherwise in 2028, when we get Final Fantasy, what's the joke? Final Fantasy VIII Recycle. We're going to be it's going to look dire if the graphics have not continued to that level 8 years after the original.
Right. I mean, I'm guessing that at this rate, we're looking at that as like a PS6 release, and I'm guessing they'll have to make some serious tuning to the system, the engine. But I don't know, man. Like I just like don't get caught up in stuff like that, to be
Yeah.
honest. I sound like a jerk by saying that, but it's the truth.
No, not at all. Not at all. I'll tell you what you do have, though. You do have a good ear. So let's talk about the sound in this game. Before we get to the obvious, which is the music, I'd like to talk about the voice acting because I played the English vocal track for Remake, and I was pretty damn impressed. I understand there's some criticism online, but again, it's online. There's always going to be criticism. I really enjoyed it. I thought some of the acting was fantastic, perfect in some cases. Updates, the characterizations, the voices, they almost matched the voices that were in my head when I was playing the original game. I was pretty darn impressed. Again, I never watched Advent Children, so I don't know. I haven't heard those voices. I don't know what these characters, quote unquote, sound like. But I thought it was great. How's the voice acting here?
Oh, I mean, first of all, I'm curious. What is the criticisms online of the voice acting in the first one? Is it Sephiroth?
It's everybody. It's like, Cloud sounds too much like a little wimp. And
okay, awesome, great. That's what I get for
the
asking.
Usual. Or Barrett Barrett sounds like Mr. T, and I'm like, yeah.
Oh God.
Like what?
Okay.
Like, what do you want? Like, that's yes.
Barrett's voice actor is fantastic. He has maybe the best range in this whole game.
Like, what's the joke? He understood the assignment.
Yeah, exactly. He did the task he was given. Yeah, which is not a small thing. As a teacher, I can say that.
I think that a lot of the criticisms, like most things of Final Fantasy Remake, have been lost since the release of the game because
that's fair.
Because people shut the hell up eventually because, it's people like to complain. So when it
they
comes
moved on to something else to complain about.
This is terrible. And then they find something else and those complaints are lost in the abyss, unless you, of course, go on Reddit to look for hints on how to beat Hell House. And then you're like, oh God, okay, this is not helpful. But it sounds like the voice acting here is just as good as the original.
It's maybe even stronger because I feel like these characters have had that time to sort of live in these characters. The woman who plays Aerith, I know she does like some streaming elsewhere as well. And gosh, she's just like, I keep talking about Aerith and I'm just going to keep talking about Aerith. I'm sorry. Like she's so fantastic. She does like so many different ranges and emotional moments, like not even the ones people are maybe thinking of. She's like fantastic, but I think the whole voice cast is great. The guy who plays Red 13, I think in particular, for reasons I cannot say, does just excellent work. I don't know, like the voice acting here, I think is like from top to bottom, like for a game that is dealing in so many different tones and moods and weirdness and pathos. There was never a moment where I was ever pulled out of the game because I was like, oh, that's a little bit off. And I usually am kind of critical of voice acting and not at all here. I thought it was just excellent.
Well, that's wonderful. And another thing that pulls you into the game, of course, is the music. Final Fantasy VII has a understandably legendary soundtrack, and that was one of the real standouts of Final Fantasy VII Remake was the sheer amount of music in this game that was inspired by the original, that were updated versions of the original, rearrangements, there being like jazz versions of classic songs that you can collect throughout the world. There was so much astoundingly good music in Final Fantasy VII Remake. Has that continued in Rebirth?
Oh, it's even better. Like I remember listening to the remake soundtrack and being like, okay, I've heard a remix of this song maybe for the 8th time, and while maybe you didn't need to remix it 8 times, it's still really good. This time, like there's only a couple songs that get remixed a bunch of times. Aerith's theme gets remixed like 25 times. I'm not even joking. But the rest of it, like the way they deal with like the different iterations of the overworld theme in the different zones is really, really cool. Like to kind of like blend the motif of like those songs in with these different zones. I feel like Hamatsu, or however you say his name, kind of got the feeling of what really worked about the remake soundtrack and decided to go a little bit further with it in terms of his remixing and taken, and I hate to reference 14 here, but taking maybe a little bit of a page out of Soken's book, where Soken is very willing after all these years to kind of pull really disparate threads together of classic songs. And I feel like that's what's happening here as well in really, really beautiful ways. I looked at my wife and I was like, we got to order the special edition of the soundtrack right now. Like, I need this in my collection. She's like, we don't have any shelf space. I don't care. I need it right now. So, yeah, it's, I don't know. Again, how much of that is driven by my nostalgia and like driven by like, oh gosh, this song that I've loved since I was 12 is here in this version and it's this beautiful. I don't know. So it's always hard to separate that, but I loved it. There were multiple times when I wept listening to different arrangements of songs that I adore.
This is, I mean, I know it's a remake, but it's obviously a mainline entry. This would be the second mainline entry of Final Fantasy that we've gotten in the last 8 months. The previous,
True.
of course, being Final Fantasy 16, which you gave a 97. I don't want you to, compare and contrast at length, but given the two games, their statures, the combat systems, which one do you prefer and why?
Well, one I gave a 97 to, and one I gave a 93 to. I prefer 16 probably because they have very different design philosophies in terms of what they're trying to do. And I respect both of them, and I obviously love both of them. Like 7 Rebirth is like, let's throw as many different things against the wall and see and try to make as much of it stick as possible in a way that I really liked, in a way that I thought was really delightful and fun and silly a lot of the time and goofy and made me laugh a lot, with really excellent character work and all kinds of stuff. But, even before release with Final Fantasy 16, they were like, we're not going to go play Clive Ball because that doesn't make any sense because like we're like, I don't know, trying to like save the world. And that is a good encapsulation of what 16 is like. 16 is a more linear experience, certainly. The zones aren't nearly as large. You're moving from thing to thing with maybe more carefully designed dungeons and more carefully designed levels. The combat was certainly easier than Rebirth for me. And I like the story a little bit more. And I like I was going to say like the character work maybe a little more, which is insane because the character work in Rebirth is great. But I think that 16 was controversial, and sure, 7 will be controversial, but I do think it will be, at least amongst the community, quote unquote, slightly better received than what some people perceived as a glorified action game, which is what a lot of people accuse 16 of. But I personally prefer 16, but I don't think that will be the consensus.
Yeah, 16 was it was a pure action RPG, whereas this is despite everything that I said about the being not good at the combat, that's not saying that I don't appreciate it. I think that one of the strengths of Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, obviously, is how they have updated the combat system, and it still is ATB. Like it's very much inspired by the original, but updates it in a much more active, action RPG esque way. I think it's ingenious. Whereas it seems like, from what I've heard, 16 is a much more very good, but still straightforward action RPG. So I guess it just depends on which side of that you want to come down on.
And that's interesting because normally, like, I'm a turn-based guy. Maybe like less so as I've gotten older, maybe. But yeah, it's definitely different. And I think that if they want to make people happy, which I think that is actually like their whole philosophy with the main line nowadays, which some people might criticize, I think they might adopt more of what the 7 trilogy is doing for the main line. Actually, I basically guarantee it.
Yeah. I'm going into a spoiler here, not for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for Final Fantasy VII. And we're not spoiling Rebirth. Don't worry. I have an odd feeling that the internet is going to lose their collective shit for one of two reasons. One, in Rebirth, Aerith is going to die exactly as she did in the original game, or she won't. And I can't help but feel that I'm really hoping this doesn't happen. It might not happen. That the result of that is not going to be the controversy that defines this game. Because I thought that the choices that were made narratively in Final Fantasy VII Remake, I know that you had some problems with the end. I thought the meta choices were quite ingenious in a way that opened the door for them in Rebirth to tell a story that wasn't bound by the original. And I'm hoping that they exploit that. You haven't let on whether or not they have. Don't worry. I'm hoping they exploit that freedom and they don't just kind of still go about the exact same thing exactly as it did in the original. Because I have to admit, in Final Fantasy, like as ingenious as I thought it did get a little frustrating eventually when the stupid phantoms would show up to stop something from happening that I found inherently interesting, like Barrett being stabbed by Sephiroth at the end of Remake, right after the president dies. I was like, right. Holy shit! And then he was healed. And I understand the narrative. The narrative point of that being like they can't let Barrett die here, obviously. But when it happened, I was blown away. And instantly the results of that, the consequences of that story beat were never followed up on in a way that felt earned. And when they broke free of fate, I was like, in that case, I'm really hoping that any new story beats, any changes that are made are followed up on and are actually explored in Rebirth.
I will say that I think that people on both sides of the aisle will be happy with that particular issue. Mm-hmm. It honors 7. It does. It just does. Like it reproduces those big, massive, amazing moments that you remember, but it recontextualizes a lot of them, but not in like such significant ways that it swerves things dramatically, at least for most of the runtime. I won't talk about the ending at all, except that I think it will be divisive. I will say that. I don't think they could do literally anything that wouldn't be divisive, right? Mm-hmm. I think it will be divisive. I have some criticisms of it that I can maybe share at some later date. But overall, I was very happy with the package I was presented with. And again, my issues with the game were never the meta-narrative elements. It was the way they were presented. And that the exact thing you just talked about is one of the issues I had. Like, if you want to try to play around with it, like, play around with it. Do it. Don't just, like, do, like, some head cloud building slashing Sephiroth fight, and that's the way you handle this. Like, bake it in, like, do it for real and not in a way that doesn't allow them to pay off any of the choices they want to make. So I think that importantly, it manages to be an organic story that feels like its own thing. Even if you hadn't played 7, it'll still feel organic and it will still feel, I think, like it's telling its own story, even though I think that your enjoyment of that will be increased dramatically if you've played 7. So that's a non-answer, but that's the best answer I can give.
No, I completely understand. To be completely honest, we did kind of spoil it. Aerith does die in this game. It's just not our Aerith. You mentioned it earlier that Zack is moving her body.
Yeah, the holy material falls out of her hair and everything. So yeah,
it's very much. You know what that is? You're not a Star Trek fan. Beginning of Star Trek 2.
I've seen that.
Beginning of Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan. When Wrath of Khan was announced, the script got leaked by Gene Roddenberry, of all people, because Spock died like really early in the script, and he was furious at it. So he leaked the script and created a fan outcry. So they rewrote the script. And then as a nod to it, in the first like 5 minutes of the movie, Spock dies in a simulation. And then Kirk has a line where he says, "Aren't you dead?" And it's fantastic. Very funny. So I'm not saying that that's a reference here, but it feels like a reference here.
Yeah.
Okay. A few other just random questions that you can or cannot answer if you want, or you don't want to spoil it. Is everyone's favorite 50-year-old, 32-year-old here?
Yes.
Okay. Does he look like he's 50 years old, or does he look a little bit more age appropriate?
No, he looks like he's 32.
Oh, good. Okay. So I'm glad that they, because God, oh, Sid, good old Sid Highwind.
Actually, of all the people they changed the characterization with, it's him, but I think they had to, given that he's like basically just an abusive jerk in the first one. So he's not like that at all in this version. So that's all I'll say.
He still wants to get to space, though.
That's not even brought up, honestly. He's totally
really?
Like he is presented very differently in this version, in a way that I thought was delightful and fun. He's still like got the same basic spirit of Sid, but he's just like a fun guy, happy-go-lucky Southerner. So yeah, I enjoy him.
He's a Southerner?
He sure is.
Wow, the voice in my head when I looked. Okay, that's really interesting. That's completely different than the voice in my head. He was like hardcore British Cockney.
I could see that based on the original one, but no, he's a Southerner for sure. He's got a Southern accent, like Georgia through and through.
Okay. Kate Sith, the characterization here, I have to admit, I never looked this up, but I have an odd feeling that there are a number of reaction videos online of the reaction to the plate falling and then Kate Sith showing up and just like
oh yeah,
doing a Charlton Heston at the end of Planet of the Apes in front of the Statue of Liberty, going, "You blew it up!" Like it was the most. If I had not played 7 and I didn't know who this character was, I'd be like, "What the? Who the? Why is there an anthropomorphic cat crying about the plate falling?"
You know, I actually really like the way that Kate Sith is characterized in this game. I feel like he's pretty thin for reasons, I guess, in 7. Whereas here, I feel like he comes together in a way that makes sense, and he's a fun addition to the party. So that is a huge compliment given where he came from.
Yes, the character wasn't a joke, but certainly he was never a member of my party in the original game. Let's put it that way.
Never.
My last question about the combat system is in Remake. They made a very interesting choice in Remake, which was you didn't have any control over who was in your party. You were given a party makeup as you went, whether the party was split in half because you're exploring Shinra Labs, or in the final battle, you're kind of just thrown together with various people. In this game, can you select your party, or are there story reasons why you always have certain party members in your party?
No, you can definitely select your party in this game. They will split you up a lot. That happens in the original as well. Yep. They'll split you up and sort of have you go this way, that way, the other way, kind of just to force you to engage with certain characters in ways that I thought were pretty organic and pretty fun. But no, there are definitely lots and lots of moments where you are able to select your party, even in the very early going. Like you have, 5-6 people to choose from. And I experimented a lot with different party combinations.
And they level up with you. So party members who aren't in your party level. Oh, thank God. Okay, good. That's, I can't, it's one of my biggest pet peeves when playing an RPG is when your party members, the ones you don't play are just in the background. They don't level up. And then you get to a point in the game where it's like their story and they step up and it's non-optional. And
I wonder why you don't like Octopath.
Yeah, you're at like level 14 and the rest of your party is at like level 37. And you're like, okay, this is not going to go well for anybody.
Yeah, it's true. I'm not a fan of it either. It's one of my few criticisms of Octopath.
It's not, at this point, it's not even a quality of life. It's just like, what are you doing?
I agree.
Okay. Final Fantasy VII, I guess this will be the discussion question for this episode. And this is going to be dependent on, I guess, the conclusion of the game. Final Fantasy VII, I keep calling it Remake, Rebirth, Recycle. I think that was the joke. I've made it on here before. I just love the joke so much. It's so stupid, but I just love it. Final Fantasy VII 3. What do you expect is going to happen? This is going to happen in 4 years from now. So we're not going to hold your predictions too seriously here. But where do you think it's going to go in terms of additional characters, in terms of where the story takes it? What do you think the world select is going to be? The world location is going to be? What do you think?
I was talking to someone else about this the other day. I think that Vincent and Sid will definitely be playable. They're not in this game, but they will be in the next game. And I
firmly expect Vincent to have his own little edgelord piece of DLC off of this.
I really hope so. Gosh, I'd love to play that. But my honest opinion is that it will be very faithful to the second and third disc of Final Fantasy VII. Remarkably so. In a lot of ways, the same way that this one was. I don't see any way they're going to be able to give you access to the entire world the way that you would have had in the original, because I don't even want to know. I think that my file was 150 gigs to play this game, and the demo was 48 gigs or something crazy like that. So unless they do something insane, I don't think you're going to have access to those previous areas. But I think that it's just going to be a further refinement. I think this game is going to be well received. I think that they're going to want to get it out the door as quickly as possible, partially because I know Square Enix is not happy with how they're doing financially. And so I think that it will be very faithful to what has come before. I think that the ending itself will probably be pretty faithful to what's come before. And that's my honest opinion.
I am a little bit hopeful about this because they've been doing such a good job expanding and recontextualizing the storylines in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it sounds like Rebirth. The third disc of 7 was always my least favorite. There was just a little bit too much anime bullshit for me that goes down.
I feel that for sure.
I'm really hoping that they can ground it in a way that these games feel a little bit more grounded than the original. I hope anyway. It's exciting. I mean, they're going, given Final Fantasy, the ending of Final Fantasy Remake, I wouldn't be surprised if they did something completely batshit insane. Like, I don't know, Squall shows up or something.
It's not impossible, but I don't know, man. I think that there would be such an outcry, more of an outcry than for anything else if they just go totally veer off into left field. Mm-hmm. They're going to stay within the general confines, and they'll make some adjustments here and there, and they'll certainly make some changes. And a lot of what they do with all that stuff is less meta in this game. I will say that.
Okay.
And it's more actually just story. It's more just narrative. So I don't think that they will probably go too wild, but you never know. They could do it at any moment they wanted to. You know what I mean? So yeah. This game does not do that.
Okay. Well, that's actually a relief because there was a small part of me that was wondering about that with all the different timelines and things, whether or not they were going to go, I don't know, full Kingdom Hearts or something like that.
There's pieces and parts of Kingdom Hearts here, but not for real. And no, I wouldn't be nearly as high on it. I think Nomura. It's funny because Katase apparently is the one who wants to do the more off the rails stuff, and Nomura's like, no, I love Final Fantasy VII. Let's make it like Final Fantasy VII. I'm like, really? You want it to be like understandable? Have you played your games?
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about
of course,
Rebirth, because this is going to be one of the biggest games of the year. It's probably going to be one of the biggest games of next year if Sony releases the PlayStation 5 Pro and then a better version of this is released on it with the DLC, which I would be very surprised if that doesn't happen.
Oh, me too. I mean, I think there's a possibility we'll get 2, but at least 1 for sure.
Yeah, and we're not going to know we're not going to get the next game for at least 4 years. I don't think if anyone is feeling that's a long time. I mean, it is a long time, but these aren't small games. Let's put it that way. I know Final Fantasy VII feels like one game, but this is not one game. These are 3 giant games.
I mean, I dropped 95 hours on this one. Let's put it that way. And I didn't do everything, not even close.
Yeah, that is, in other words, you're going to get your money's worth out of the content that's in this game.
You could beat it in probably 45 to 50 pretty easily, but I wanted to really, partially because I was reviewing it and partially just because I was enjoying myself, I wanted to poke around a lot. So, yeah.
Well, another way that you can get your money's worth is by going to our shop. You can do so by heading to www.rpgfan.com/shop. We have lots of stuff in there, including, we have our usual, the t-shirts, the mugs, lots of merch. The really big piece of merch, though, that we'd like to, we're promoting for a while now is that Hyperplay RPG is a zine company located in the UK, and we teamed up with them to release the RPG Fan Review Card Collection, which is a showcase of nearly 300 of our review cards. As you can see on Instagram, most of our reviews get review cards, like little bite-sized versions of the reviews. So yeah, take a look at that. I have a few in there. Zach, you have a few in there. I just love this book. I have a copy on my shelf right now. I was delighted when I got it. It's a pretty darn cool book. So I would check that out.
It's my favorite book, honestly. It's the only book that I own that I mentioned in. So yeah, I like it.
Yeah. Another way that you can support us is by checking out our past episodes of Random Encounter. So last week, we had an interesting chat about the Playdate, which is, I don't know if you've heard about it, it is a bite-sized handheld with a crank on it. This was released a few years ago after a great deal of fanfare and delays, and it's a very interesting little console that has a very interesting way of released games through seasons, and kind of looks like a Game Boy. Like there's a lot of nostalgia tied up in this thing, but it releases modern games, but they're in black and white with an amazingly detailed screen. I've wanted one for quite some time now. That conversation just made me want one more. So give that a listen. You can also check out Retro Encounter. Last week was part 1 of chatting about Dragon Quest XI: Echoes of an Elusive Age. Zach, I know you are
all-time classic for the record.
I know you are a big fan of this. I remember I played it, and after I played it, I was like, I did not enjoy this game at all. And then I was like, I'm sure that some people agree with me, and I put on the episode, the spoiler cast of it, and I was like, nope, I'm alone in this.
I remember that.
Yeah, but there is, despite my opinion about a lot of actually most of my opinion about this game is based on the last act. I like the first two. So if you love Dragon Quest XI, absolutely give this a listen. And part 2 will be coming out next week. We also have Rhythm Encounter, which is RPG Fans music podcast. The show will be back next week, appropriately with an episode featuring the music of Final Fantasy VII. So we talked a little bit about the music of Final Fantasy VII here. Obviously, it's a all-time great soundtrack. And we're going to be focusing on some of the best music from that game. If you'd like to get in contact with us here at Random Encounter, you can fire us off a message at podcast@rpgfan.com. Please, send us a message if you have any ideas for future episode themes. If you have ideas for discussion questions, if you want to take the burden of thinking of discussion questions off of my shoulders and just give me one to ask the panel, I welcome that. If you'd like to send me an email directly, you can do so at jlogan@rpgfan.com. You can also find me on Mastodon at jonologan@mastodon.social. Zach, where can we find you online?
The best way to reach me is email, zachw@rpgfan.com. You can also find me on our Discord as ZachW.
Excellent. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would love if you could share it with your friends to help us get the word out there. You can rate us on iTunes or your other podcast players of choice. You can also find us on lots of other places. You can find us on YouTube now. We are like our YouTube channel. We've been posting regularly, and then YouTube made a changeover, and finally they're kind of posting podcasts normally. So you can find all our podcasts on there, along with some absolutely fantastic video content that we've been working on. Scott's been really great with that lately. So please check that out. Zach, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for plowing through this game. Like it's not a small game. It's not a small game in terms of the time you have to put into it, but it's also not a small game in terms of what it represents.
Yeah, it was a big one for me personally. I think of all the games I've reviewed here, and you and I started right around the same time. I think this is the one that I felt the most pressure with. So yeah, I hope that people enjoyed as much as I did.
Yes, I am. After talking to you about it, I am very, very hopeful, and I am extraordinarily intrigued about where this story is going to go. Okay, and I assume that everyone out there is really, really excited to play this game. Download it on the 29th. My suggestion is stay away from the internet, except for our website, read Zach's review. But once you start playing the game, stay away from the website and make up your own mind about what's good or what's not here. Let your own reactions be your guide to whether or not this is a worthy follow-up to Remake and Final Fantasy VII as a whole. Because the choices that are made narratively in it, I have an odd feeling that based on what I've played thus far in Remake, they are going to be well thought out, and at the very least, they are going to be thought-provoking, I think. So I'm excited to make up my own mind about this, and I hope
I agree with that
too. Yeah. So whether or not you're playing Final Fantasy VII or you're playing anything else, whatever you're playing, have fun.